what is Oracle Security? Well, Oracle Security is basically a whole bunch of things put together that secure data. They secure access to data and information and the structure and metadata of an entire database or small pieces of it. It's done with a number of tools. Basically, there are things called schemas and users. What is a schema? Technically, a schema is a data model, as shown right here. This is a data model. As you've seen before in this course and the previous one, it's basically a bunch of tables all hooked together and related together, divided up using what's called normalization with normal forms. It's the way that we build relational databases. That's a schema. It's a logical thing. Coupled with that is a thing called a user. Users, unlike table schemas or table structures, are people in the database or certain types of power users that are allowed access to the database itself. You get people called DBAs, database administrators, who can generally get at everything, system users who can get at everything and then some, including starting up and shutting down the database, and you've got developers who can build stuff but not access all the underlying database technology, and then you have application end users that can generally access small chunks of data as opposed to metadata. When you take the schemas and the users and you put them together, you actually get the same thing. A DBA user is a little bit like a schema, except that it doesn't have any tables built into it per se for application use. An application end user would have access to tables in a schema, which is also a user. Sorry if it's a little confusing. And a developer would have access to some database DBA system type functionality. In other words, he can create tables, he can create indexes, or she, but they can't necessarily go and shut down and restart the database. So DBAs and system users have access to the entire structure. Developers have access to individual schemas and some administration ability in terms of the logical side, the schema, the tables. And the application end users generally have access to data, the stuff stored in the tables in the schema. So what is a user? A user, in this case, we're talking about system users who have access to the entire database. DBAs have access to the entire database, but sometimes not quite as powerful as a system user who can restart the database. And then you have developers who are allowed access to metadata, some of it usually locally and specific to applications, thus at the schema level. And then you have application users talking to a database through a web server or an application server or through an online internet site or a client server application. Sometimes they have specific usernames in a database, but for licensing purposes that can sometimes get a little bit expensive. And the way that OLTP databases work nowadays, it's much more efficient to use second-tier application and web servers. Which leads us to the internet users, which is a large group of unknown users, but a far larger and diverse group than your in-house system users, DBAs, and developers. This is a large part of Oracle Security, dividing up the different users and giving them access to different things in different ways. One particular way that an internal Oracle user, as in a DBA, a system user, a developer, or an internally allowed Oracle application user, one way that we apply security is by use of password authentication. In other words, when you log into an Oracle database and you connect as a user called Joe Soap, it wants you to put a password in to make sure that you're you. Internally in an Oracle database, there are also things called privileges. A privilege allows you to perform a certain action. In this case, we're looking at system privileges. System privileges allow users to do things such as create tables, indexes, sequences. As it states here, they allow you to create database objects. In other words, you can do things to metadata, the things that define the schemas, the tables, the things, the bits and pieces that define the actual database structure, not the data itself. The object privileges, on the other hand, allow you access to something such as the objects in the concerts schema. So in this case, if an end user had access to the act table as a select privilege, it means that that end user would be able to go into this particular schema in this database by whatever means, either by a direct Oracle user created for that specific user or through an application server, and that user would be able to select the data from the act table. You can also assign object privileges that allow DML activity, that allow a person to change data in something like the act table. In that case, you would apply or assign insert, update, and delete privileges to that person for that particular table.